All right, diving in today, getting into something that I think is super relevant for anybody who is, looking at those senior software engineer roles out there. We're talking about microservices.
Yeah.
Um, and, at the senior level, you really need to know more than just how to, write the code. You got to make architectural decisions. You got to understand these things inside and out. You got to be able to talk about them.
Absolutely.
So we're going to cut through the noise today.
Yeah. We're going to extract just the core understanding you need for those technical interviews. We're going to focus specifically on what microservices are, how they relate to SOA, which is service-oriented architecture,
Right.
and the fundamental principles that really underpin this whole architectural style.
Okay. So microservices at a glance, what is the elevator pitch?
So microservices are independently deployable services that are modeled around a business domain. And basically what that means is instead of having one gigantic application, you have a system that's built from these smaller services that talk to each other over a network. So you can think of it like, for example, an e-commerce system might have an inventory service, an order management service, a shipping service.
Okay.
And each one of these services is a microservice.
Okay.
It operates independently. And this gives you a lot of flexibility when you're trying to solve problems in different areas.
And so then how do microservices relate to this concept of service-oriented architecture, which I know everybody's been talking about forever?
Yeah, so that's a great point because actually microservices are really just a specific type of SOA.
Okay.
It's just that with microservices, they have very strong opinions about things like how you define the boundaries between those services,
Right.
how independent they should be when it comes to deployment.
Right.
But there's also a really key advantage here is that they tend to be technology agnostic,
Oh, okay.
which is huge. You're not locked into using the same tech stack across every single service.
So I know you mentioned the word before, but you said that from the outside, a microservice is treated like a black box. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, so what it means is that you're going to be thinking of each microservice as this kind of self-contained unit.
Okay.
So it exposes its functionality through these well-defined network endpoints,
Right.
like, message queues, REST APIs, things like that. And it's going to use whatever protocol makes sense for that particular service.
Okay.
So other microservices or even other applications, they interact with that microservice only through those exposed endpoints.
So the internal workings are completely abstracted away.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the internal implementation details, like the programming languages that are used, the database maybe it uses, all that is completely hidden from the consumer of the service. And another key point here is that microservices generally try to avoid having a shared database.
Okay.
So if a microservice needs some kind of data storage, it's usually going to have its own dedicated database.
Okay, so that makes sense for keeping things isolated.
Mm-hmm.
And so this all leads directly into this principle of information hiding, right?
Right. Yes, absolutely. Information hiding, that's one of the key principles in microservices.
Yeah.
The idea is you want to maximize what's hidden inside the service and minimize what is exposed through its interfaces.
Right.
And the reason this is so important is because this separation, it makes it much easier to change things inside a service without impacting anything outside of it.
Okay.
Like you can change the internal logic as much as you want, but as long as that network interface remains stable and backwards compatible, other services that are talking to it are not going to be affected.
Right.
And that's what allows teams to work on and release individual microservices independently, on their own schedules.
Okay.
And so this whole idea of having these well-defined and stable service boundaries, that's really key to making sure that your system is loosely coupled and that each service has strong cohesion within itself.
I think this is ringing a bell a little bit because we talked about hexagonal architecture in a previous deep dive.
Right?
And I'm seeing a connection here. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, there definitely is a connection there. So the hexagonal architecture, which, if you remember, was this concept from Alistair Cockburn,
Right.
it really emphasizes separating that core business logic from how your application interacts with the outside world.
Okay.
And so you interact with the core through these different ports and adapters, which are basically just different types of interfaces.
You got it.
And a lot of times when you see microservices visually represented, they're represented as these hexagons.
Okay.
And that's a direct nod to hexagonal architecture.
Right.
And it's also a way to kind of distinguish them visually from just sort of like a general service.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So it's not just, a completely new thing. It's like, it's building on, previously established architectural ideas.
Exactly.
So now let's really dig deeper into this whole SOA versus microservices thing. So you said microservices are a type of SOA.
Yeah.
But you also sort of hinted at the fact that there were some, challenges with how SOA has been implemented over the years. Can we get into that a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So service-oriented architecture, if you boil it down, it's really just a way of designing systems where you have multiple services that collaborate with each other over a network.
Okay.
And they're usually running as separate operating system processes.
Got it.
And the idea is that they all work together to achieve some kind of business goal.
Okay.
So SOA, it emerged because people were trying to deal with the complexity of these huge monolithic applications.
Right.
And they also wanted to try to promote software reusability.
Okay.
So in theory, SOA had all these great benefits. It was supposed to make maintenance easier. You were supposed to be able to replace one service without messing up the whole system.
Okay.
As long as the core functionality of that service stayed the same.
Right.
It all sounded great on paper.
So where did things kind of go off the rails then?
Well, the thing is, while the principles of SOA are good, the actual implementation of it across the industry has been, well, let's just say, inconsistent.
Okay.
So there wasn't always a clear understanding of how to do it well. So sometimes the focus shifted to the technology, to like specific vendor solutions instead of staying true to the architectural principles.
So people got bogged down by the tools instead of focusing on the end goal.
Exactly. And a lot of the challenges that people had with SOA, they weren't necessarily problems with the core idea. They were more about like the choices that people made.
Okay.
Like they picked really complex communication protocols like SOAP.
Okay.
Or they relied heavily on middleware from particular vendors.
Right.
And there wasn't always a clear guide on how to actually decide like how big your services should be.
Right.
Like how do you actually break down a system in a good way?
Right. Right.
And to be a little bit cynical, I mean, some people even say that like the SOA movement was partially driven by vendors who were trying to sell their own product,
Right.
which, that could have made it harder for SOA to be successful.
So they were trying to do smaller independent services, but it still ended up being really tightly coupled.
Yeah. I've seen a lot of SOA implementations where they wanted to do smaller services, but they were still all sharing the same database,
Right.
which meant you couldn't actually deploy them independently.
Right.
And you still had this risk that if one thing went wrong, the whole system could go down. So it wasn't really true microservices.
Right. So it sounds like then if SOA was sort of the vision, microservices is a more refined, a more practical iteration of that based on, what we've actually learned from trying to do this in the real world.
Exactly. You could think of it like the agile movement.
Okay.
SOA is like the broad philosophy, and microservices is a specific way of actually implementing those principles well.
Well,
It's like extreme programming or Scrum. There's specific frameworks within this larger idea of agile.
okay.
So microservices, they came about because people learned from experience and they figured out what design principles actually work to build these really resilient and scalable distributed systems.
Okay. So that really clarifies the difference between those two. So for someone who's going into a senior level interview, like what are the key takeaways that they really need to be able to clearly articulate?
So first and foremost, they need to understand and be able to explain what a microservice actually is.
Okay.
It's an independently deployable service that's organized around a specific part of your business.
Right.
They need to really get this concept of the black box nature of microservices.
Okay.
Like the internal stuff is hidden, the interfaces are well-defined.
Right.
And finally, they need to be able to talk about how microservices, while they're based on SOA, they're actually like a more opinionated and often more successful way to actually make a service-oriented architecture work in practice.
That is super clear. So to everybody out there who's getting ready for those senior interviews, I'm going to leave you with a final thought to ponder. Think about how these principles of independent releasability, information hiding, like all this stuff that's so core to microservices, how does it impact not just the tech itself, but how teams are structured, how development actually happens within an organization?
Right.
Because if a company adopts this architectural style, those things are all connected. So
Yeah.
really thinking through those bigger implications, that's going to show a deep understanding in your interviews.
Absolutely. It's not just about the tech. It's about the whole ecosystem surrounding it. And if you can understand those connections, you'll have much better perspective on how to apply these principles effectively.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.
Sounds good.